Catherine and I'm a speech pathologist as a part of the Oak Health team. Over the next 4 modules, we're going to be talking about how you can partner with families when you have a child that you feel like needs a little bit of extra help. How to have those conversations, how to take some observations that will help make that conversation a really productive one with the family and help the child get the support that they might need. So for today, we're going to talk about why bring up concerns with families. Why do we need to do that? Why is it helpful? We're going to talk about what a positive conversation looks like with a family. We're going to talk about identifying children that need a bit of extra support and how we do that and what that looks like at Oak. And we're going to finally talk about how we can record some descriptive observations that's going to help our conversation when we start talking with the family. So we have 3 choices for bringing up concerns that we might have about a child. The first one is to just avoid the conversation and not bring it up with the family at all. And often that can have a bit of a negative impact. Obviously the child then doesn't get any support that might be helpful, and also it can be quite stressful in the room for you to not have that extra support or feel like you can provide that extra support that you want to offer that child. Sometimes we might avoid the conversation because we're worried about how it will go, and that's really what we're going to be talking about today, how we can feel more confident to go into these types of conversations with families. And sometimes we might be worried about how the parents might feel, whether they're ready to hear that information. There's lots of reasons why we might avoid a conversation. The second option we have is having the conversation, but not really having it in the best way. And what that means is it also results in negative outcome, and it might result in some sort of distancing with the family or a negative relationship with the family. And again, this is sometimes something that people can be worried about happening. So what we're going to be looking at across these modules is how can we have the conversation that needs to happen and also make it a positive conversation so that the child gets the help that they need. You can have that ongoing relationship with the family that we know is so important for both the children's development and also for our satisfaction in feeling like we have that relationship with the children that are in our care all the time and the children that and the families that we're working with. So just to have a little think about what is a positive conversation. And a positive conversation isn't always one where the parent will follow through on exactly the suggestion that you've made. A positive conversation is a conversation where the family feels like they understand what's happening with their child at the campus. A positive conversation is one where the family feels confident and safe to contribute their own ideas, to contribute their own observations of the child at home. And a positive conversation is one where you can come out of it and feel like there's a clear plan. And even if it's not the plan you might have gone in thinking about, there's a clear plan for what is moving forward and when you might reevaluate the plan and have that ongoing conversation. There are plenty of benefits to partnering with families and working with them, particularly with children that have some additional needs. We know that when we can partner with families in a positive way, that extra information can really help guide what assistance and supports might be helpful. So it might mean that maybe applying for ISS for an extra person in the room to help be able to provide some smaller groups can be possible. Or you might get a health request and one of the speech pathologists or OTs can come out and spend some time working with you on some strategies that you might be able to incorporate to build a child's talking skills, play skills, motor skills. So we can open up some avenues like that, but then there's some other benefits as well. So when you are partnering with families, you've got some idea about what's happening at home. That might give you some context to what you're seeing at the campus, or it might give you some clues about some other strengths that they might have that you might not be seeing at the campus for whatever reason. And then also when you are partnering with a family, you can look at all of the information together and work out, okay, what are our goals going to be and what are we going to do so that we are all doing and working on the same thing. So if you've got a family at home that's working on building up a child's sentences, and at the campus you're focusing on making sounds or using actions, then the child is not getting practice of either of those two things particularly well. So if you're working together, you come up with an agreement and then you're all working on the same thing, the child is more likely to have better outcomes. Let's have a look at that a little bit more. So what skills do we need to identify a child that might need some extra support? So the first part of that is to understand what's typical development for a child of that age. What's the normal range? We know every child is different in how they develop, but there's usually a normal sort of age range that certain skills develop. And you can use the early years framework, milestones at the back of that document to guide your thoughts around that. And the health team or your director might also have some additional resources that you can use to help guide your thinking about a child's skills. And then the other part of identifying and working out if a child might need a bit of extra support is understanding from the family's perspective and from what the family has seen, what are they like outside of Oak? What cultural practices do they have? Sometimes we might see some children who aren't feeding themselves, and that might be because at home, culturally, a child doesn't have the opportunity to feed themselves because they are fed until a certain age by their parent or by their grandparent. Thinking about the child's history of illness or trauma, if they've had grommets or ear infections and needed grommets, that might impact how they're communicating now. If they've had significant life changes or violence in the home or things like that, can have a significant impact on how they're developing. And then also thinking about, what are the family's routines, what work demands do they have, what does that family life look like? And so we're looking at a child's development in all of that, with all of that in mind. So a key part of working out if a child might need a bit of extra support is recording some really descriptive observations. And you will already be starting to do some of this through your snapshots each day and through your grow stories, and when you're thinking about planning the learning for that child. You might just take a few extra detailed observations and descriptive observations for a child that you've got some questions about. And then you can sort of compare your observations with things like the developmental milestones to see whether maybe some more support might be needed. So when you are taking those descriptive observations, you're having a look and looking at exactly what you see and what you hear the child do or say in particular situations. You're looking at who they are with when they are doing something and when it is happening. So, for example, you might say, Bessie uses one word to ask for something she needs, water, when she's talking to an educator who she knows quite well. But if it's an educator she doesn't know well, she usually just looks at the water instead. And if she's with a friend, she is interested, she might want a toy, she might look at the toy. That's usually what we've been noticing when she's wanting something. That's how she's communicating. So that's sort of describing exactly what you're seeing in that environment, and then you can have a look and go, okay, well, is that what I'd expect for a child roughly that age? What's contributing to what we're seeing, and what is the family seeing at home? It's going to open up that pathway to having those conversations. So we're going to talk through some examples of some descriptive observations, and these are actually really helpful to start sharing with families. And we're thinking about how we describing what we are seeing. So, for example, instead of saying Jenny wasn't using her gentle hands today, we could say, we could describe today Jenny approached a few of her friends and she was pulling their hair. And I haven't noticed her approaching her friends before. When her friends made a noise, she watched them really closely. I found that really interesting. It was happening this morning quite a bit. So you're sharing it in a very neutral way and describing that situation. Or it might be a completely different scenario. It might be, today Jenny approached one of her friends and pulled her hair. I noticed that she was asking her friend to play just before that, but her friend wasn't responding or wasn't answering her. So you're describing exactly what you saw in the situation, who was there, when it was happening, what was happening around it, and just describing what you've seen. Another example that we could look at is, Jessie wouldn't sit down at group time today. It's a very common thing that we find at the campus, that children might not join the group, and sometimes it might you might want to feed that back to a family. And so you could describe, okay, today Jessie stood near the group and was looking at the book for maybe a couple of pages, and then he went off to have a bit more of an independent play, and he played pretty independently. And when we invited him to join the group again, he chose to keep playing by himself. But when we were singing, I noticed that he was looking around and watching what we were doing from the other side of the room. So you're giving that family, or you've recorded a really detailed observation of exactly what events happened. Might give you some clues for planning. Maybe songs straight up in group time might help get Jessie in. But it also is giving the parents a really clear picture of exactly what's happening in that scenario. And there's no judgment about what Jessie's doing. It's just simply describing the events that you've noticed. And it can allow you to then move forward with the conversation with a family and start to discuss things that they've been observing at home. They might be surprised by what you're noticing. They might be just think that it's very common what you're noticing. It just opens up that conversation. There is some information that you can speak to your director about recording detailed and descriptive observations in the Oak Grow pedagogical documentation guide. So you can chat to your director about that if you'd like some more examples about how to phrase and describe and record your observations. You can take a minute now to have a practice of recording a descriptive observation. Have a think about a child that's in your room and just jot down something that you might have seen and heard, who was there and when it happened during the day, adding as much detail as you can. Just to finish off, we're going to quickly have a look at the difference between identifying and assessing or diagnosing. So at this point in time, when you're looking and wondering if a child might have some additional needs, it's important to recognise that you're at the very start of the process, and your role is to identify some concerns that might benefit from a bit more discussion and exploring. So having a look at this process, you can see that the first step is identifying. Then there might be some more specialised screening or assessment by a specialist. So at Oak, the screening might be done by the speech pathologist or the OT, and then otherwise they might just access an assessment outside of the campus. It might be with a paediatrician or a speech pathologist, physio, psychologist, occupational therapist. And then you can see at the very top there, if there's therapy needed or a diagnosis that needs to be made, then that is done at the very end of that process. So you can see we're at the very start of the process. So we actually don't have all the answers at this stage. You can record what you're observing, and that's really important information to share with the family, but we cannot make a diagnosis. We're not qualified to make a diagnosis of anything specific, and we can't really provide any answers for the family about exactly why something might be happening. And it's important to feel confident in that too, because sometimes families will want you to tell them exactly what you think is wrong, or if you think they have something in particular, and the thing is, you just can't answer because there's a whole process that needs to happen, and you're just at the start of that process. So keeping in mind that identification and identifying a child that might need some additional support doesn't mean that you have to have all the answers, doesn't mean that you need to know what the long-term outcome is for that child. So why act now, and could we just wait and see? And this is often a question that parents will ask, and we find that there are some challenges if we just wait and see. So we know that evidence shows that when we get in early and get strategies in early, there's better long-term outcomes for the child. It can help reduce their frustration in the moment and help them, really engage with the program at that time. And then there's also better long-term outcomes from getting things started a little bit earlier. And then there's other arguments as well, that it's the right thing to do, that there are economic benefits, and to be trying to support children to keep in line with their developmental expectations. So thank you for joining me for this first module. We've just got started on where we're going to go with this work around partnering with families when a child needs a bit of extra support. Go away, have a little bit of a practice at recording some detailed observations, and then in the second module we're going to be having a look about how you can prepare and set up for that conversation you'd like to have with that family. Look forward to seeing you soon.